Hi, everybody. So, we're here this week to talk about Confucianism, the next of the four traditions that we'll be looking at in this course. This is a tradition, of course, that's quite different from Hinduism. It's coming from a different place. It's developed in China rather than in India. We will see some similarities, I think, in terms of the deep themes of these two traditions, and I'll try to point some of those out. But I want to invite discussion of those too in our class, as well as in the forum this week. So let's dive right in and have a look at what this tradition is about. All right. So here we have an image of Confucius. Confucius is the person, of course, responsible for the originator of Confucianism. And we're going to talk a little bit about that to start with. Basically, what is Confucianism, of course? We're going to look at some of the key concepts. And like with Hinduism, there's going to be a set of a few specific things that I want to emphasize that's going to help us follow the logic of the readings for this week. I want to look specifically at the theme of government because you'll see that our reading from Gardner, the secondary source on Confucianism for this week, focuses on that in one of the chapters. I think that's a theme that's especially relevant for us in the United States today as we read these texts. And finally, we'll just walk through some of the passages in the Analects that stood out on my reading and that I'd like to highlight for everyone. All right. What is Confucianism? Well, it stems, as we've said, from the teaching of Confucius. When did he live? About 551 to 479 BCE. That's before the Common Era, or before Christ, we would say, in the Western traditional context. There's a lot of debate as to whether this is a religion. That's going to sound familiar, like with Hinduism. Here, it's less that it's, well, actually, you could say it is embedded in the culture. I mean, it certainly has been a defining part of Chinese culture for many years. Here, the alternative conception is to think of it as a kind of humanistic philosophy and ethics, right? A social or political philosophy. I mean, it has to do with conduct, and we'll get to look at some of that in detail. It's important to understand the historical context in which Confucius developed these ideas. This is at the very end of a period known as the Zhao dynasty, and I want to apologize. I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of the Chinese terms, so if anyone is watching this who knows Chinese, apologies. At the end of that dynasty, which was a very long period in Chinese history, China entered what is known as the Warring States period, with a lack of recognition of the successor to the last Zhao emperor. The country fragmented into warring tribes and regions, getting up into the dozens around the time Confucius lived. It was a period of chaos, opportunism, violence, and of a break with a lot of the traditions of the society. Confucius was not, therefore, describing his society as it was. He was describing it as he thought it should be, and to some degree, as he thought it had been under the Zhao dynasty earlier on. So he's looking for models of how a society should be run, and he's referring back to the earlier practice of that dynasty. This tradition of Confucianism, and we won't get into the details of its reception or development, which are many, of course, the thing to know is that this tradition was taught through what were called the five classics, the Confucian classics. Students seeking positions in government or in the bureaucracy of government would study these classics. They would take examinations on them. They would be expected to know these works. Much as the Bible did for centuries in Christian cultures, Confucian classics provided a common vocabulary, a common set of images, analogies, metaphors, things that educated people knew. People who had learning, as we will see. It's a key concept for Confucius, and it's a big concept. But the extent to which these works were studied and adopted brought itself a kind of unity to Chinese culture over a very long period of time. We said we would highlight some of the comparisons with Hinduism. Well, like Hinduism, Confucianism is focused on right practice, certainly belief There's a certain element of that, but the overriding emphasis is on what it is right to do, not so much what it is right to think. It blends a kind of humanism, a philosophical position about the goods of human life, with religious practice in the form of various rituals. And we'll see a couple images of that in a moment. One influential scholar of Confucianism has described it this way: it sees the secular as sacred. So usually those two are put together, separated, right? So the sacred is in churches and synagogues and mosques. That's religion, right? And then there's the secular, which is government, business, economics, everyday kinds of operations. What Confucianism does is it takes these two and it sees them as interlaced with each other, right? So that the secular itself becomes, in a way, the sacred, and vice versa. This is one reason why it's so hard to classify this in terms of, is it a religion, is it not a religion? According to our Western categories, it's simply hard to say. The concept of heaven, or tian, is important here. We will talk about the mandate of heaven when we discuss government in a few moments, but we can compare this idea of heaven to the idea of Brahman, which has been so important in the course so far, this underlying impersonal substance, right? So heaven is not a place in the Western sense, right? So you get heaven and hell, and then God lives in heaven, according to the image, right? That's not what heaven means in the Chinese context. It means kind of the force or the principle, the substance of the universe, of reality, much as Brahman did. I mean, they're different concepts, and we could get into the details of those, but that would kind of go beyond our scope. Practically speaking, a lot of people point to this Confucian work ethic, comparable to maybe the Protestant work ethic in a Western context, as a reason for the really astounding economic success in many Asian countries, in particular China, over the last several decades. So the values of Confucianism continue to be very important, even among people who might not, in response to the question, what are you, say, I am a Confucian, right? I mean, everybody, in a certain sense, is formed by this tradition in China. So just a few images. I mean, I'd like to be a bit more visual than we are, but I'm trying to get through a lot of concepts as well in a short time. Here we have an image of Confucius teaching in a kind of statuary form, clearly. And ritual not only means, as we'll see, kind of everyday rituals, things that we individually do according to a proper form, but there are actual ritual ceremonies and traditional costume and other elements, such as you see here and in the following image. This is, I understand, set in Korea, where also, so outside of the nation, the country of China, Confucian ideas and practices have had an important influence. Let's get into our key concepts, our second point here. So we know generally what we're talking about. What do we need to know? Well, Confucianism calls for self-cultivation, kind of self-discipline, a self-enlargement, right? Morally strengthening yourself. Through this, we improve what are called the 5 relationships. So immediately, this has a social implication, right? What are these? Father, son, ruler, subject, husband, wife, older brother, younger brother, and friend to friend. Are there other relationships? Of course, but traditionally these are called the 5. Right? What is the aim? To regenerate, and what I'm quoting here, it's mostly going to be from Gardner, unless I say it's from the Analects, to regenerate civility, harmony, and ritual elegance in Chinese society. Why? Remember, these were lost. These were gone, right? They had collapsed in this warring states period, and Confucius wants to find ways to bring them back. So as we did with some of the key concepts in Hinduism, I want to set these out for us here. What is the main goal? We've already said self-cultivation. Well, there's a word for that. It is junzi, a person of moral nobility. Now, as Gardner helpfully discusses, this term originally applied to people who had been born in a higher social class, basically, right? They were noble. However, Confucius, and this is one reason for the appeal of his thinking, in a certain way democratizes this, at least makes it more egalitarian. Anyone can be a junzi. You don't have to be born wealthy to ascend, as it were, to this state. All that it takes is learning, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The opposite of the junzi is the xiaoren. which I just mispronounced, I'm quite sure. This means the small man. And smallness here has to do with the quality of one's character, not one's stature, right? So a small man, as we'll see when we look at the passages, seeks after material things and position and advantage, whereas the junzi, the gentleman, the person of moral nobility, seeks after truth and true goodness. How do you become a junzi? Well, as I said, it's learning, right? Learning should be open to all, and one needs only to learn to have a genuine determination, to be genuinely determined to learn. Ji. So I have this quality and it drives me in my studies. And the studies are not meant to just help us get a bunch of facts, fill your head with a bunch of information. I mean, clearly here I'm trying to fill your head with a bit of information, right? But hopefully that's not the entire point, right? You need to know these things in order to appreciate the tradition, in order to have, in this larger framework, a better life, a more enlightened and awakened kind of life, right? So there has to be a comprehensive vision, or as Confucius himself puts it, according to Gardner, one thread leading through everything that you learn. So you're not just gathering facts. Through learning, the junzi becomes a man that should be of ren, and obviously that's man or woman, a person, right? Ren here is translated by Gardner as true goodness, and you will see that he gave some discussion there of the question of translating this term. It's not obvious. It's also sometimes translated as humanity. And he points out, Gardner, in his discussion, that according to Confucius, it's very hard to maintain this. I mean, why? Because we're always falling back. We're always becoming a small man, a small person, morally, right? And to maintain virtue consistently is a great challenge. We are guided in achieving that by what is called li. And that's maybe our last main concept, which is ritual, right? So as Gardner puts it, we're necessarily both guided by the Ren through a set of rituals. Now, rituals doesn't just mean putting on traditional costume and going through certain movements. How you act when you go to Dunkin' Donuts, talk to someone at the register, how you speak to someone you meet in the grocery store, how you interact with your husband or wife, with your child, with your mother or father or family member, right? All of that is guided by a certain kind of social convention. Now, if we just give no thought to that and we interact very carelessly, Confucius is proposing to us, society will be chaotic. It's going to start looking like that warring states period, right? Where no one knows quite who they are, where they are, what they're doing. He thinks that through the proper enactment of li, these ritual actions, which he's quite almost fastidious about, he's quite careful about them, society can be rejuvenated and brought back to what he sees as the right form. One passage here from the very end of the first chapter of Gardner, then we'll go on to our next topic. Gardner writes the following: From the family, the child learns that the world is naturally hierarchical, that hierarchy works effectively when there exist clear status differentiations and clear roles, that each status has set normative responsibilities attached to it. For example, there are behavioral norms for being a good son or daughter. That enmeshed in a hierarchical network, a good person is one who carries out the responsibilities associated with his status, and that harmony of the whole results from each person within the hierarchy conscientious fulfilling the duties demanded by his defined role. This is a moment where we can consider a similarity with Hinduism. Remember, in Hinduism, we looked at this caste system, the stages of life, or the varnas, right? You have a certain position in life. You are of this age, you are of this caste, you are of this social position, and from this follows a certain dharma. Right? You have your dharma. We just got done looking at the Gita, right, and Gandhi's translation, which emphasizes the importance of each person doing her or his duty in order for, well, enlightenment to be achieved in that context, right, recognizing one's oneness with Brahman. Here, the aim is a little bit different and more concrete. The aim is social harmony, but the vision is similar. There is a hierarchy, everybody has their role, but that doesn't mean that people above you in the holy order, the hierarchy, right? They're not better than you necessarily. They might be. And if they are, they're morally better than you, right? So a rightly ordered society will be an aristocratic society in the sense that the aristos, the best, the most morally good people, will rule that society and set the tone for everyone else. Let's talk about that and look at government, our last topic. So individual self-cultivation is not an end in itself, right? This is not just about achieving enlightenment for oneself. It's about a practical problem. Stated at the beginning, we're living in the warring states period. We need to achieve social harmony, right? So we look at the figure of the ruler. And this is the key figure for Confucius, because this is the one, as I just said, who's going to set the tone for everyone else. Quote, Gardner, the Confucian ruler possesses an inner virtue, day. This inner virtue exerts a spiritual ethical power over others, and the ruler exerts a fixed and reliable moral authority throughout the realm. Here's an image to put with that before I comment on it from the Analects. The virtue of the superior man is wind. The virtue of the small person is grass. Right? When the wind passes over the grass is sure to bend. In Confucianism, there's a great confidence in the ability of a morally upright, a decent ruler, right, to transform the society through his or her example. It's important that the ruler have ren, true goodness, that he, let's say, uphold li, proper ritual conduct, right? That he be a junzi, certainly, that he have learning. All of these things that we talked about are to be concentrated in the ruler. And this goes quite far. Let's comment on this. I think I meant to put this in another order. But this quotation is important. So we're talking about trust, right? Because if the ruler is regarded, is recognized by the people as being good, morally upright, a true junzi, right, gentleman, then that person will have authority and there will be peace, right? Everything else be damned. So let's have a look at this line here. Zigong asked about government. The master said, let food be sufficient, let military preparations be sufficient, and let the people have trust in you. So this is what Confucius says to Zigong, what do I need for good government? Well, I need food, I need the military, and I need trust. Zigong replies, if you have absolutely no choice but to give up one of the three, which one should go first? Very practical question. Confucius replies, let the military preparations go. Zigong says, if you have absolutely no choice but to give up one of the remaining two, which one should go first? Confucius, let the food go. Since ancient times, nobody has escaped death, but if the people lack trust, the government has nothing on which to stand. These lines, I think, are of great consequence in our moment in the United States today, right? Because we are facing a question about trust in government and about the character of our leaders of all parties and all levels of government. So I invite comment on this, certainly, in the forums. A last slide about government here, and then we'll just look at some of the passages. So as Gardner discusses it here, the ideal ruler thus not need even govern actively. Here we have a line from the Analects. The master said, ruling through non-action, is this not Shun? Shun is a ruler, he's a person, right? What did Shun do? Assuming a reverential pose, he faced due south and nothing more. What an idea, right? That the ruler is so virtuous, and this virtue is so manifest and recognized by everyone in the society, that ruler's simple existence, he simply faces south, he adopts this traditional kind of Chinese posture reverentially and does nothing, and people are virtuous in the society, right? This is the ideal ruler, not force, coercion, law, balance of powers, simply the recognition of a good moral example. All of this is connected with what's called the mandate of heaven, or Tianming, Tian being heaven, as Gardner writes. On the face of it, this idea is simple enough. A concerned heaven, right, this impersonal force, a heaven invested in the well-being of the people, confers a mandate to rule on virtuous and benevolent men who, like heaven itself, are committed to the people's welfare. To maintain the mandate, these men, these people, these rulers, and their successors must never abandon virtue. If they do, if the rulers go bad, they forfeit the right to rule, and heaven withdraws its mandate. For those of you interested in political philosophy, there's a comparison to be made here with the philosophy of John Locke, right? The right to rebel against a government which has failed to uphold its end of the social contract. This is not precisely a social contract view because it's talking about heaven. It's talking about a kind of metaphysical reality, right? However, people can gain and lose this mandate, and the fact either way is to be recognized by how people in the society react. If the society begins to crumble, that is itself evidence that that ruler has lost the mandate of heaven, that he or she is not acting virtuously. I want to have a look at just some of the passages in the Analects, just for a couple of minutes here. This image from Wikipedia is apparently an image of the oldest existing manuscript of this work, the Analects. By way of introduction, the Analects is a collection of sayings, of course, attributed to Confucius and his contemporaries and disciples. They are grouped according to theme within the chapters, so there's a kind of coherence in each chapter, but no overall structure. It's just an assembly of quotations and anecdotes. It treats themes in social and political philosophy and education, especially for reasons that should by now be apparent. This was the main concern of Confucius, and it is today, of course, a foundational text in Confucianism. And as I said, these values, whether or not one calls oneself a Confucian, continue to influence people's thinking. Some passages. This is the opening passage of the first chapter of the Analects, and the most famous one. The master said, "Is it not pleasant to learn with a constant perseverance in application? Is it not delightful to have friends coming from distant quarters? Is he not a man of complete virtue who feels no discomposure, though men may take no note of him?" So here we have this ideal of learning, right? It doesn't just mean going to college. Although go to college, it's a good thing. That's a place where you can learn. But learning is something bigger. The master said, "Smooth words and an insinuating appearance are seldom associated with true virtue." You can wonder why. Well, if you are truly virtuous, and if that virtue has the kind of power, the authority that he's been saying it does, you don't need to be sneaky and slimy and bending the truth. In fact, if you are, it's almost evidence that you're not virtuous. Let's have a look at the others here. Let's have a look at this first one. Zija said, "If a man withdraws his mind from the love of beauty and applies it as sincerely to the love of virtue, if in serving his parents he can exert his utmost strength, if in serving his prince he can devote his life, if in his intercourse with his friends his words are sincere, although men say that he has no formal education, I will certainly say that he is learned." That's, I think, a valuable passage to understand what Confucius means by being learned. He doesn't mean having a lot of degrees. He means the things presented in this first passage. The master said, "If the people be led by laws and conformity is sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment and have no sense of shame. If, however, they be led by virtue and conformity is sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, ritual, li, right, they will have a sense of shame and moreover will become good." So if I'm imposing by force rules on someone, they're going to try and get around them. But if they recognize the value of that ritual, right, that it conduces to true goodness, they'll do it on their own, and they will, in fact, Confucius thinks, become good. The master said, Confucius. Famous passage, his autobiography passage. At 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right. What do we have here? On the one hand, we have an autobiography of Confucius. On the other hand, I think we have something similar to what we saw in Hinduism, that at different stages of life, there are different almost appropriate activities, levels of achievement, recognition, enlightenment, if you want. It's not the same concept in Confucianism, but different degrees of maturation that occur at different times of life. The master said, "The accomplished scholar is not a mere utensil for spoon-feeding his students." I have to remember that, right? The accomplished scholar, like the ruler, teaches by example in a certain way, right? Ooh, that's the charge. That's the charge. It's not just dispensing information. You're not an instructor, right? If you're a scholar, you're like a ruler, right? Your teaching comes not through the information you provide, but through that single thread that runs through all of it and is picked up by your student. Zigong asked, what constituted the superior man? The master said, he acts before he speaks and afterwards speaks according to his actions. There's orthopraxy for you. Act before you speak and act rightly, right? And then base your speech on that right action. The master said, the superior man has a universal outlook and not provincial. The mean man is provincial and not universal. The word provincial in English comes from the idea of the provinces. So in France especially, the countryside is the provinces, right? Different provinces, different regions. We call them counties, maybe, right? And the cities are where, sophisticated people live, the urbane people, the educated people. So when you have a provincial outlook, it means that you have a very local, narrow kind of outlook, just of your little town or village or region, right? Whereas a person in a city is more likely to have a more universal outlook because they interact with more people. Confucius said, riches and honors are what men desire. If they cannot be obtained in the proper way, they should not be held. Poverty and meanness are what men dislike. If they cannot be avoided in the proper way, they should not be avoided. If a superior man abandons virtue, how can he fulfill the requirements of that name? The superior man does not, even for the space of a single meal, act contrary to virtue. In moments of haste, he cleaves to it, virtue. In seasons of danger, he cleaves to it, right? So there's no moment where, as a superior person, let's say a superior person, you can just give up on virtue. Oh, I'm going to have a pint of ice cream, or whatever. A pint of ice cream is okay. But you know what I mean. There's no gimmies, right? There are no little breaks. If you're going to be a superior person, you have to consistently be so. So clearly I'm having some kind of recording issue, and I think I'm going to wrap this up. Here we have, in the last two passages, some discussion of the superior man and what we call the small man, the jiren. Thank you for your attention. Let's go back. Thank you for your attention, everybody. Sorry about the technical difficulties, and I look forward to talking about all of these ideas, also in relation to what's happening in our world today, in our discussions and work this week. Thanks.